Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the solo. That's right, the one-player game, Final Girl, designed by Evan Derrick and AJ Porfirio, and published by Van Ryder Games, who helped sponsor this video. A familiar story in horror films is that after a young girl's friends have all been hunted down by a dark and sinister killer, her fear gets replaced by resolve. Instead of flight, her instincts drive her to fight. And with everyone else dead, there's only one person left to face the evil. And it's you. Here, you're the Final Girl. Final Girl is a game that uses a unique feature film system. To play, you're always going to need this, the core box, but you also need at least one of these feature film boxes to combine with it. Each feature film provides you with two unique Final Girls you can play as, pictured on the front and back, and also a unique killer, Hans, the butcher, in this case, and a unique setting to face them in, here, Camp Happy Trails. But not only that, once you have more than one feature film, you can mix and match the killer from one box and the setting from another, using any Final Girl from any of the sets that you own. In this way, you can create a variety of different challenges to experience, and although each box offers several unique twists to the gameplay, the general rules for how they're played remains the same. In this video, we'll use the core box and Camp Happy Trails. So join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, choose a Final Girl to play as. And if this is your first time playing, you'll find these in a feature film box. But in the future, you can store all the Final Girls you've collected in the core box, since any Final Girl can be played in any game. As an added bonus, you can support the show here by picking up this additional Final Girl separately, which is based on Watch It Played's own Paula Deming. And you'll find a link in the description of this video that will take you to where you can get your own copy. Next though, set this player board from the core box into the play area with either this normal or the extreme difficulty side face up. But for your first few games, they recommend using the normal side, so that's what we're going to do here. You now put your chosen Final Girl in the space here beneath your player board, and we'll use Reiko for this video. Your hero always starts with the side face up that shows these outlines of people on it. The cards with this back are the actions. Find the 6 with a 0 and hourglass symbol in the bottom right hand corner and set them aside as your starting hand of cards. The rest you'll sort into separate piles of matching names. Now, some of these piles will have 2 cards each, and others will have just a single card, but all of them together make up what is known as the action tableau. Nearby, set the 6 dice, tracking and health markers, black and white health tokens, regular yellow victims, 3 special victims, these 3 tiles known as the victim holding boxes, and their matching tokens. Now take your chosen feature film box and detach both of its magnetic lids, flipping them face up. One of these is the killer board, and the other is the location board for your game, and you'll set both of these in your play area. In the feature box, you'll also find the killer finale cards, which show the killer's top half, and their dark power cards, which show their bottom half. Shuffle these decks separately, and then deal one of each of them onto the matching spaces for them here on the killer board. And then the leftovers you return unseen back to the box. Speaking of which, you'll notice that the feature box has 2 sides of components, one for the killer and one for the location. Take the cards labeled as terror from both sides and notice that these components will be uniquely labeled with a symbol somewhere on them so you can easily sort and separate them after the game is over. In this case, Hans shows a pig face, and Camp Happy Trails shows a tent. For now, though, we're going to shuffle these together. From this combined deck, deal 10 of the cards face down into a terror deck, setting the rest unseen away from the play area. Find the location's item cards, shuffling them together, and then deal 4 of them face down above these 3 titled areas. And then, once you have 4 of them dealt to each of these stacks, flip the top card of each of these piles so that they're face up, and any items that you have left over, you can now return unseen back to the box. Now find the location's setup cards, shuffle these, and deal one of them face up, returning the rest to the box. This will show a small version of the location board and indicate the starting place for your hero, represented by this icon, the killer, represented by this symbol, and values, which are how many regular victims you add to each of those spots on the board. So with this setup, your board begins this way, but the next time you play, it could be something different. And I'll also just point out, I'm laying the pieces down so they're a little easier to see in the video, but of course when you're playing, you can stand them up. Now gather these 9 black final health tokens, ensuring the side showing a die is face up. Mix them thoroughly and don't look at their other sides while placing one onto each of these circular spaces of both the killer and player board. Then, again, without looking at the other side of these tokens, put the rest of them back in the box. And we'll learn the reason for all this secrecy with them a little later. Now check the killer's health value here and add a number of these health markers to this area of their board so that the number of these markers plus the final health token equals this total value. Our killer has a total health of 12, so we'd add 11 health markers. We then do the same for our hero, checking their total health value, shown here, and adding markers to the player board so that the number of markers plus this token equals their health. On the killer board, set this bloodlust marker onto the bottom space of this track, and then note the value here, because you'll now set this large red figure onto the matching numbered space of what is known as the horror track. Then put this time marker onto its starting blue space marked here. The cards with this back are the location's events, which you shuffle into a face-down deck, flipping one of them face up. Some, like this one, present ongoing conditions you must consider as you play, while others might require adding new victims or making other adjustments, but we'll discuss events more later. For now, just ensure that if there are any extra components related to your killer or location, which you'll find in their related boxes, that you've made them available as well. For Camp Happy Trails, it will include these tokens. Your location or killer may have special rules to consider while playing, and these will be detailed on a separate included sheet. But as you can see, in this case, we don't have any extra rules to worry about. And that's the setup. In Final Girl, you are the final girl, facing off against a horrific killer that's hunting you and your friends. You'll be searching for items to fight back, trying to rescue other victims, and desperately trying to stay alive because the game can only end in one of 2 possible ways. Either you destroy the killer, or the killer slays you. Now, in the very rare case that you both die at the same time, you still win because your sacrifice stopped the monster. The game is played over a series of turns, each broken into 5 phases, starting with the action phase. Here you'll play cards from your hand, resolving their effects and placing them into a discard pile somewhere away from the action cards that make up the action tableau. To ensure they stay separated, I find it helps to put your used actions face down. There are several different types of actions, and these allow you to do things like move, attack, search for items, rest, and a variety of other things. Rather than go through each possible card you could encounter, I'm going to teach you how to interpret the information you'll find on them, so no matter which one you're playing, you'll be able to resolve it correctly. And we can cover a lot of the rules related to action cards by going through a very basic one, walking. If the card shows 3 rows of words and symbols, as most of them do, it means you now have to make a horror roll. To do this, first check the current horror level, which is based on which section of this track this marker is on. This tells you how many dice you get to roll. If the marker is on the red space, then you roll just 1 die. If it's on one of these green spaces, you roll 3. And if it's on any one of these white spaces, you roll 2. Certain abilities you may acquire later in the game could increase or decrease the number of these dice that you get during a horror roll. But you will always roll at least 1 die. So if something was telling me I had to roll 2 less than the 2 I'm supposed to roll, I'd lose one of these from my roll, but I always keep my last one. Now, it is possible you could get enough bonuses to be allowed to roll more than the 6 dice that come in the game. If I was told to roll, for example, 8 dice, I'd first roll these 6, I would then note the result and re-roll 2 of them, adding their values to what I'd gotten previously. Either way, after rolling, check your results. A 5 or a 6 will show a star, and a star is a success. Every result of 3 or 4 shows 2 card symbols. This means you can now choose to discard any 2 cards in your hand to a face-down used action pile to treat this die as a success star. And if you roll a 1 or a 2, you get a blank side, which counts as nothing. After getting your final results, you now resolve the row on the action card that matches the number of successes you rolled. If you got 2 or more successes, you gain the result of the top row. If you have only 1 success, resolve the next row. And if you gained no successes, you resolve the bottom row. Sometimes, like we see here, an outcome will have more than one option to pick from. So if we had had no successes, we could pick to resolve either this row or the one after. Now, you always resolve the effects on a row from left to right. So if we had gained 2 successes, we would first move up to 2 spaces. Anytime you move, you go from the space your final girl is in to an adjacent space, which are any connected by a line. So I could go from here to either this, or this space. And since I'm able to move up to 2 spaces, I could then move again. Now I should point out there's no limit to the number of pieces that can share a space together, and you can also freely enter the space with the killer and leave it. To explain some of the other rules related to movement, I'm just going to set up some examples for us here. Anytime you're in a space with victims, you can take up to 2 of them with you when you move. They're scared to death and will gladly follow your lead, except into a space containing the killer. So I could move from here to here and take 2 victims with me. But if I now wanted to enter this space, they'd stay behind. That said, if victims are already in a space with the killer, they will gladly leave it with you. But again, at most, only 2 will go with you at a time. If at any point during the action phase you're on a space with this exit symbol, any victims in those spaces, whether you just brought them here or if they were already there, may now be saved. Now I say may because you don't have to save them, but you'll usually want to. This does not cost you anything. You just immediately move them from the board to any one of these empty, available victim-saved spaces on your final girl card. For each space you fill, you immediately gain its printed reward. For example, adding one here lets Reiko move 1 space for free. When this victim is rescued, if I put it here, this space lets me take a planning action card from the action tableau and add it to my hand. If you gained more than 1 reward, you can decide the order you take them in, but you must resolve all of them before you play your next action card. Once all the victim spaces on your final girl are filled in, you now remove the victims, returning them to the supply, and flip the final girl over to the other side. You've now unlocked your ultimate ability, which you can resolve anytime it would apply. Also, anytime you rescue a victim from now on, you resolve the effect shown here. And in this case, we see a green sand timer and an up arrow. That symbol means you move the sand timer up the time track here. Now, time is very important, as we'll see, but you can never have more than 12. So if you ever reach the top of the track, just ignore any extra time you would gain while this marker is here. So going back to saving victims again, just to be clear, victims are only saved if they're in an exit space and the final girl is there too, even if she's just passing through. So if I was moving 2 spaces and went here and then here, these 2 victims just got saved if I wanted to save them. But these 2 victims here, they're going to hang out on this exit space until I get over there. Look, the victims they're very frightened and they aren't very bright. It's why they likely aren't going to survive long enough to be the final girl themselves. Okay, so that was moving, which was the effect of resolving this first top outcome. And then the next effect on that row is to perform this sand timer and down arrow. This is the time it cost you to perform this action. To show this, you move the marker here down 1 space. Sometimes there'll be a value with the symbol, meaning you lost that total amount of time at once. So in a case like this, you'd be losing 2 time. Time is a representation of what you're able to do before the killer and other events in the world perform their actions, and eventually you'll run out of time, causing the action phase to end. That said, if the time marker is on the 0 space, you can still take an action, no matter how much time it ends up costing you. So let's say I do have 0 time, and I want to play focus, and it ends up costing me 2 time. I would just advance to here, and then after the action is over, being on the time space by this symbol means my action phase ends, and then I must move to the next phase of the turn. If you're getting low on time during your action phase, you can gain more by discarding cards from your hand, and for each one you get rid of this way, you gain 1 extra time. You'll find reminders of this on the back of the rulebook, which shows the phases of a turn and the 3 uses of an action card. Playing it for its effect, turning this die side into a success by discarding 2 actions, or gaining 1 time for each action card that you discard. Going back to the walk action, you'll notice that if you fail the horror roll, you still have the option of moving 1 space if you pick the first option, but then you must resolve this symbol. And this symbol means that you lose 1 health.
When you lose a health, discard a health marker from your player board. The killer also has a health track, and we'll see how they can lose life later, but when they do, you remove a token from their track instead.
This symbol that we see on the short rest action instead heals you 1 health.
When this happens, you add a health marker to your track, but the hero and the killer can never have more health than their original maximum. So Reiko, for example, can never have more than 6. Don't forget, this token also counts as a point of health. And if it's ever the last token on either the killer or the final girl, you're now running on adrenaline. And this symbol means that you get to roll 1 extra die on every horror roll you perform. So if both of these are the last tokens on their related tracks, you get to roll 2 extra dice per horror roll. If either track gains a health back, then this related bonus goes away until it's the only health marker here again. If you ever need to remove health tokens and this is the last one you have remaining, you instead flip it over. If it's blank, the final girl has been killed and you lose the game. But if it hadn't been blank, if it shows a certain number of hearts instead, you come back to life in a classic horror movie twist. You then add this white final health marker to your board and as many other health markers as necessary to get the total number of hearts showing here. This shows 2 health, so I'd add 1 more marker to show that I now have 2 health remaining. The black finale token you can then discard. And the same can happen to the killer. Once you've dealt the final blow to them, you flip this token, and if it's blank, you win. But if it instead shows hearts, they've come back to life. You now set a white finale token here, and the hearts necessary to bring you to this total. It doesn't matter how much damage the killer or final girl are dealt before they come back to life. Any extra damage is ignored. In other words, if the final girl had just this 1 health remaining and then took 3 damage, you'd flip this token and ignore the excess damage, placing all of the health that it shows here onto her track.
Also, if the final girl or killer comes back to life, the current phase, whichever one it is, ends immediately and you go on to the next phase.
A character that loses their final point of health when they have just this token will not be coming back. They are now defeated.
Okay, so we've had a chance to talk about a variety of different rules in the game, but let's go back to examining the action cards you might play and the things that they allow you to do. You won't start with this action in your hand, but we'll see how you can gain new actions like this one later. And once you do have this, you can use it to attempt to search.
To do this action, you must be on a space with this search symbol that we see here, and the name that's on that space will then be paired with one of the labels beside one of the item decks at the top of that location board.
If you're resolving the top line, you take 2 cards from the related deck to examine, picking one of them to keep and placing the other one face up on top of the deck that it came from or face down on the bottom.
If you place it on the bottom, this may mean there's no face-up card on top and you leave it that way. You don't automatically flip the top card face up.
In the rare event that there are no cards left within one of the decks, it means there's no items left to search for at that space.
Anytime you gain an item, either place it in your hands here or your backpack. And at this point, you can freely rearrange all items between your hands and backpack as you like. But rearranging can only be done when you gain a new item or during the upkeep phase, which comes later. But otherwise, you can't freely move things around. Things are happening too quickly for that. You're being chased by a killer.
You have 2 hands, and if an item has a 1-hand symbol, it takes up one of your hands to hold it. Now, if it shows 2-hand symbols, it takes up both of your hands. So I could hold the lid and revolver together, or just one of them. But if I wanted to hold the axe, that uses both my hands, so I couldn't hold anything else at the same time.
There's no limit to how much you can have in your backpack, but the effects on items that have a hand symbol are only active while they're in your hands.
If an item has no hand symbols, it's available for you to use at any time its listed effect would allow. For example, this energy drink says it can be used during the action phase. Many items can be used over and over again, but this says that you must discard it when used, which means you'd then remove it from the game. Other items may have multiple but limited uses, and these will show a number of circles on them.
When you first gain an item like this, add a number of these markers to its empty spaces, and each time you use the item, you remove one of the markers. Once there are no markers left, the item is spent and can be removed from the game. We're not going to go through all of the items in the game, as how they work is explained on them, and you'll understand how to interpret their effects by the end of this video. But weapons like the bow and revolver are used when you attack, and we'll discuss those items again when we discuss attacking, which we're going to do next. To attack, you must be in the same space as the killer, or have a weapon that allows you to attack at a ranged distance. The range of a weapon is shown here. With a 0 range weapon, you must be in the killer's space, but with a range of 1 or higher, you must be that number of adjacent spaces away. In other words, I'd have to be 1 space away to use the revolver. I couldn't use it 2 spaces away, or even while in the killer's space. The values are precise and have to be followed exactly. You don't need to have a weapon to attack, but to attack without one, you'll need to be in the killer's space. Whether using a weapon or not, to attack, you must play an action that can cause damage, which is represented by this symbol. You then do a horror roll, and let's say we get 2 successes. For each damage symbol you get to resolve, you deal 1 damage to the killer. So here we do 1 damage. But if you're also holding a weapon, as long as you inflicted at least 1 damage during the attack, you can add the weapon's damage to the attack as well. If you're holding more than 1 weapon in your hands, you can only use 1 of them during each attack. So if we use this knife, we do a total of 2 damage. For each damage you inflict on the killer, remove a health marker from the board. And don't forget, if they are ever down to their last health token, you get a bonus die during future horror rolls. And if the damage you do removes this marker, flip it over and see if they come back to life with extra health. If not, they've been defeated and you win. The weak attack action lives up to its name. It's pretty weak. But we'll soon see some other ways you can get stronger attacks that you can use. But before we get to that, there are some other symbols you might come across on actions that we should learn. Anytime you see this symbol, you get to decrease the horror level by 1. But if you see this symbol, the horror level increases. Remember, the horror level is indicated by this track. Now, if the marker is ever on the lowest space of the track and you get the option to reduce it again, for each time it should have been moved, you instead leave it where it is and resolve this symbol, which we learned means you gain 1 time. If the horror level is on the highest space and would increase, for each time it should have moved, leave the marker there, but increase the killer's bloodlust, which is represented by this symbol. Anytime bloodlust increases, you move its token up on the track here, and this can make the killer stronger, which we'll come back to and talk about more a little later. Okay, with that, you'll now be able to interpret all the action cards that you start with in your hand, and even most of the ones that you'll find in the action tableau, which you'll be able to add to your hand later, as we'll see. But there are 2 actions in the tableau that we should quickly go over right now. When you see this symbol, it means you gain an additional die. So if you managed 1 success when performing this planning action, it says that you would gain 2 extra dice for your next horror roll. This action doesn't require a horror roll. Instead, if you have it in your hand, you may play it after a roll to either re-roll one of the dice from it or pay 2 time to re-roll all of the dice. And that's everything you need to know to perform actions during the action phase. And you can keep taking actions until you run out of cards, or after you finish an action that causes the time marker to go below 0, triggering this symbol. Or if you resolve that symbol on an action you're performing. You can also end the action phase just by choosing to stop. And you may want to stop early to save certain cards for later rounds, or to have some time left over, which you can use in the next phase, as we'll see. But however the action phase ends, it's then time for the planning phase. Here you look at how much time you have remaining, and then you can spend up to that amount to buy any action cards from the tableau that you want to and can afford. Just keep in mind, you cannot purchase an action card that was played or discarded since the last planning phase. Or, if it's the first turn of the game, any that were just used during the first action phase. This is why I suggest you always put your used actions in a single face-down pile so you never get them confused with the cards that are in the tableau. You also can't buy a card if its cost would move the token below 0. The cost to buy a card from the tableau is shown in its bottom right-hand corner. So if I wanted to buy this improvise action, it would cost me 3 time. After paying for the card, you then add it to your hand, and you can buy any cards that you can afford or wish to, as long as you never have more than 10 in your hand. When you're finished buying actions, no matter how much time you have left, you then reset the timer to 6 on its track. Next, take all of the action cards you had previously played or discarded and add them back to the action tableau, including any of the initial zero-cost cards that you began the game with. You can stack all the zero-cost cards in a single pile to save space, and in a future planning phase, as long as it wouldn't put you over the hand limit of 10 cards, you can always take as many of the zero-cost actions from the tableau as you like, since they have no time cost. You can even purchase zero-cost cards if you are at or below 0 on the time track.
And that's the planning phase. Now we move on to the killer phase.
Here you first resolve the killer action, which is shown on the finale card beside this icon of their board. And we'll learn how to interpret these icons in a moment. Once the killer's action is resolved, you then flip the top card of the terror deck and perform its listed effects from top to bottom. And again, here you might get some killer-related icons as well. So let's take a moment now and learn how to interpret all of them.
The first icon in a killer action row will indicate who the killer is targeting. This symbol means they're targeting you, the final girl. This symbol means the target is the closest victim. And this final option means the killer will target whoever's closest, either a victim or the final girl.
If there's a tie between closest targets, the space with the most victims becomes the target. And keep in mind, the final girl is not considered a victim. So if the killer was targeting whoever is closest, either the final girl or a victim, in this situation, they're equally close. But we check to see which of these groups has the most victims, remembering that the final girl is not a victim. So the killer would target this group.
Given how many different ways you can combine all the different characters and cards and killers and locations in this game, sometimes you will end up with a situation that does not have a clear-cut answer, whether it's a very unique card interaction, timing situation, or a question of who the killer targets if, for example, there's more than one location tied for most victims. In those cases, the rules suggest you pick one of the following principles and apply it consistently in your game whenever those situations occur. One option is the rule of infinite evil. This means you resolve the situation so the result is the worst outcome for you. Or you can go with the rule of abject realism, resolving in a way that is the most realistic or thematic. Or finally, you can follow the rule of never-ending hilarity, resolving situations so that the funniest outcome happens. Either way, once you have the target, you then resolve the rest of the icons from left to right. In this case, we now see 2 boots, and each boot represents the killer moving. So in this case, he moves twice. How far the killer moves with each boot symbol is found in this column here, based on the killer's current bloodlust level. So at the start of the game, the killer moves 1 space per boot symbol. But if the bloodlust level was here, they'd move 2 spaces for each boot. Once you have the total movement, the killer then moves the shortest path of adjacent spaces towards its target, stopping as soon as it enters their space. Now remember, the target is what matters, which means the killer will go right through a space with even the final girl or other victims if they're not the target. If you see this symbol in the killer's action line, it means they now attack a single target in their space. And if there are multiple attack symbols, it means they'll attack multiple times, but you resolve each one separately. Each attack will target either a victim or the final girl, and the killer will always attack a victim in their space before the final girl, unless the final girl is specifically their target. I should mention though, if the killer is not in a space with their intended target, for example, let's say the killer can move 2 spaces and they're targeting the final girl. Well, this would get them to here. Now they can't attack their intended target, but if they have an attack to resolve and there is something in their space to attack, they'll attack that instead. No matter who the target is, when an attack happens, look at this column here to see how much damage each attack causes based on the row the bloodlust token is in. At the start of the game, each attack causes 2 damage, but later it could get much worse. If the target is a victim, they always have only 1 health, so they're automatically killed when damaged and any excess damage is ignored. In other words, if the killer was doing a single attack that caused 3 damage, it would still only kill 1 victim with the attack. If it had a second attack icon to resolve, then it would target and remove another victim in its space. Anytime a victim is killed, move it to this dead area of the player board and then advance the killer's bloodlust by 1 space. If the bloodlust marker ever reaches the row that says Dark Power,
You then stop and immediately reveal the killer's dark power, which is the card on its board connected to this red line. This card was randomly placed on your killer board during the setup, and when revealed, it gives the killer a new ongoing power. So each time you play, you won't be sure what dark power the killer may gain. Most killers will also have an epic dark power with a red border, and these are really deadly and should only be included in games where you want an extra challenge. With that understood, let's go back to resolving killer attacks. Now, we explained what happens when a victim is attacked. They die, and the bloodlust marker goes up. Now let's see what happens when the final girl is the target, and she is in his space during the attack. First, each point of damage removes one of your health markers. So when the bloodlust is here, it means each attack icon will generate 2 points of damage. So if Hans attacked twice, that would be 2 damage each for a total of 4 health being removed from the final girl. As we discussed earlier, if you're down to just 1 health, you'll get an extra die on all future horror rolls. And if you ever lose this final token, flip it. If it's blank, you've been slain. But if instead it shows some heart symbols, you come back to life with that much health and carry on. Either way, once you're completely out of health, you've died, the game ends, and you lose. With that said, when the killer attacks the final girl, you may be able to prevent some of the damage. Action cards with a blue background are known as reactions, and they can only be played from your hand after the final girl has been attacked, and these will allow you to make a horror roll. Based on the result, you may then be able to block some of the damage, and in the case of retaliate, you may even be able to do damage back afterwards. I should mention though, you can only play a reaction in response to an attack. It cannot prevent health loss from, say, this symbol. Also, each reaction can only defend against a single attack. So if I use this reaction against an attack, and then the killer attacks again, this is already used up. I'll have to use a different reaction if I have one and want to use it. But you can choose to use more than one reaction per attack. Just note, reactions can only be played against attacks on the final girl. You cannot play a reaction to protect a victim. So, in the killer phase, you first resolve the killer's action, which is printed here, and then you flip and resolve a terror card, which usually has the killer move and attack. Sometimes a terror card or other cards in the game may show this symbol, which we should take a moment and explain. You start with one event revealed at the beginning of the game, and getting this symbol means you reveal a new card from the top of the event deck and resolve it. Sometimes these have ongoing effects, remaining in play until you're told otherwise. And if you see a symbol here, it means there's a token you should use to mark the event's location on the board. Some cards, usually events, will ask you to add or replace a victim on the board with a special victim, and it will show which special colored piece you should add to the board. The rules for this special victim will then remain in effect throughout the game until they're rescued or killed. But in addition to any special rules they have, they otherwise follow all the regular rules for victims. With events understood, let's go back to looking at terror cards, because sometimes when you flip one of these, you'll get what is known as a minor dark power. This doesn't have an effect that's resolved. Instead, the killer gains a new ongoing power from it. When drawn, place this above the killer's board in one of these 2 spaces, setting new health markers from the supply onto the spaces shown. Now, anytime the final girl does damage to the killer, she must remove health from any dark powers first. And once all of the markers from a dark power have been removed, it is discarded, removing that ability from the killer. Any extra damage is removed from the killer's main health as normal. Once you've completed the killer phase, it's now time to resolve the panic phase, where we get to find out if any of the victims on the board panic. The final girl does not panic. And a victim will only panic if it's in the same space as the killer and at least one victim was killed this turn, no matter how or where it happened. So if no victims were killed, you can just skip this phase. But let's assume that one was. This means every victim in the same space as the killer now panics. To resolve this, pick one of them and roll a die, checking the numbers on the border of their space. If you find a match, move them in that direction to the next adjacent space. But if you hadn't rolled a match, they just stay where they are. You then repeat these steps for each victim in the space, in any order you like, rolling a die for each one. Before moving on, I should mention that you can end up with a space that's quite crowded with pieces, and if that happens, you can remove all of the victims from that space, putting them on one of these victim overflow boards, placing the matching token for that board into the space they came from. This lets you know that all of the pieces on the related board are considered to be in the space with the token. So with that, we've now covered all the rules related to the panic phase and can now move on to the upkeep phase. During this phase, you now check to see if the terror deck is empty, and if so, the killer's finale is revealed. This is the card in this space, which you now flip face up. This will give the killer a new default killer action to perform during the killer phase. Other finales may also have a special effect that needs to be resolved, but remember, the finale is only revealed after the terror deck is empty. And this means from now on, during the killer phase, you will no longer reveal a new terror card since there are none. You just resolved the killer's action here. So during the upkeep phase, you first check to see if the finale card needs to be revealed. Then you perform any effects on events, items, or other components that say they resolve during the upkeep phase. Finally, you may now rearrange any items from your backpack and hands. And remember, other than when you first gain a new item card, this is the only time you can do this. That ends the upkeep phase and a full turn. You now start a new turn, beginning with a new action phase. And the game will continue like this until you've either killed the killer, ending the game in your victory, or once you've died, meaning you've lost. But don't forget, in the very rare case that both happen at the same time, you're still victorious because the monster was defeated due to your bravery. The rulebook also provides you with instructions for feature boxes that have you facing not just a killer, but their minions. Or sometimes no killers and only minions. But these rules I'll leave for you to discover on your own when that time comes. And don't forget, there's an excellent summary of your turn and all of the icons you may encounter in the game right here on the back of the rulebook. And last but not least, don't forget that we have this very special Paula Final Girl card that you can pick up by following the link in the description of this video if you'd like to support the show and add this heroic challenger to your game. You'll also find a full playthrough of Final Girl here on the channel by Paula herself, which I'll also have linked in the description below. But otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play Final Girl. Now, with so many different expansions and possible card combinations, I won't be able to help with questions related to specific card interactions. That'd be a bit much for just one person. But if you have any questions about anything you saw in this video, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.